The New York Times, the Washington Post, Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, none of them, not one of them, says anything when Trump talks about destroying Iran or says they're going to be sent back to the Stone Age. None of these media organizations and none of their journalists, some with millions of followers, come out and say, this is appalling, these are crimes against humanity, this is evil. I haven't seen that on the front page of the New York Times. He is threatening devastation on a massive scale, devastation even beyond what we witnessed in Gaza, but somehow the only criticism you hear is that this is an unwise war, that gas prices might rise, that Trump is reckless or unstable. Maybe a few senators or a handful of members of Congress have said this is wrong or that these are war crimes, but this goes beyond war crimes. When he talks about sending a country back to the Stone Age and repeatedly insults the Iranian people, what he means is the destruction of an entire nation. He will fail, I'm convinced of that, but the cost will be enormous, and the Iranian people understand they have no choice except to remain firm. Well, that's another point I wanted to raise. And by the way, when do you need to go? I know your time is limited, in about 20 minutes. Okay, understood. Because to me this is just as important as what you said a moment ago. President Trump, both earlier this afternoon outside the White House and then again during his speech here, brought up Venezuela, and he said, if it were up to me, I'd take Iran's oil. He said, just like we did in Venezuela, we made $100 billion. We more than paid for our war during that period, so that's a very good deal. And, to the victor go the spoils. That was the phrase he used. To me, that makes his position pretty clear. And if I put myself on the other side, if I were Iranian, whether foreign minister, the president, or anybody else, and I'm hearing that he says he wants to negotiate or bring freedom to the people or whatever, but then he openly says he wants our oil, it sounds like this has nothing to do with nuclear issues or liberty. It sounds like you just want to take our resources. And under those conditions, any agreement would basically mean surrendering your country's wealth to a foreign power. I wouldn't accept that under any circumstances. How do you see it? That is precisely the issue. And notice too, you don't hear Democrats saying we should leave Venezuela and give Venezuelan oil back to Venezuelans. You don't see the New York Times shouting about that either. Once again, when it comes to looting, killing, conquest, and seizing land or assets, the empire behaves the same way no matter who is in charge. There is no real difference. When Trump lost that Supreme Court case on tariffs and gave that angry press conference, he said something like, so I'm allowed to destroy countries, but I can't put on $1 of tariffs. And he was talking about Cuba. While Cuba was being strangled, while oil was being blocked, while hospitals had no electricity and children and patients were dying, did any major media outlet in the United States say, we are killing children in Cuba? No. Because, as I've said, the same elite class that dominates political power also dominates the media. They control both. There may be different wings, different rivalries, competing factions, but on empire they agree. They have no compassion. Nobody in Venezuela, when those boats were attacked, or when operatives entered the country, killed scores of people, and kidnapped the president and his wife, saw the American mainstream press say, we are the ones doing evil. Even many of those who opposed the intervention said, yes, Maduro is bad, but we shouldn't do this. No, they are the aggressors. They are the wreckers. Whether it's Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, where they waged a dirty war for over a decade and enabled extremist forces to tear the country apart because that served Israeli interests, or now Iran, this is all part of a project of plunder and domination. The least they could do is be honest about it. They should simply say, we do not care about human rights. The New York Times, The Guardian, The Independent, all these false defenders of human rights, whether liberal or conservative, should at least admit we are colonialists in the old imperial tradition. We want what you have, and if necessary we will kill to take it, just as was done in earlier centuries. But to pretend this is about freeing Iranians, Cubans, or anyone else only adds hypocrisy to violence. The difference with Iran is that it won't work. Instead, it could trigger a global economic collapse. And that's actually what I wanted to ask you next. From everything you're saying, it seems irrational for Iran to enter any serious negotiation under these terms, and equally irrational for it to give up leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, so it seems reasonable to conclude they won't do either. And apparently by 8 p.m. tomorrow night, Washington time, Trump may begin carrying out attacks on parts of Iran's energy infrastructure or desalination facilities, bridges, and other internal infrastructure. He appears eager to move in that direction. If that begins, what should the world expect Iran to do? In response, Iran will retaliate, and because Israel is part of this war, it will strike whatever Israeli infrastructure it can. But even more damaging for Trump would be what happens to his regional partners in the Persian Gulf. Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, their critical infrastructure would become targets. Their oil facilities would be hit, their gas facilities would be hit, their desalination systems would be hit, foreign workers and residents would flee. These governments would not survive such a conflict intact. Iran would survive. It is a large country, and we've already seen how resilient the Iranian people are. We will endure, but those regimes would not, and that would trigger a deep and lasting energy crisis, not a temporary one. There would be no easy way to contain it. Tankers in the Gulf could be destroyed, sent to the bottom of the water. This would become a war for survival. The United States is leaving Iran with no real alternative, and especially because these governments are complicit in American actions. They provide airspace, territory, coastlines, and access routes used for attacks against Iran. Even operations involving helicopters or transport aircraft have depended on neighboring airspace. Without Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the wealthy Gulf monarchies opening the way, the United States could not conduct this war effectively. So Iran's message is simple: you are part of this war. You cannot claim neutrality while your territory and infrastructure are being used to destroy us. If our country is attacked through your systems, then your systems become part of the battlefield too. Iran will respond in kind, and then we'll face a crisis unlike anything we've seen before. Are there any talks happening? Because if I were Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the UAE, I would be calling Tehran and saying, don't do this, don't target us, especially not in a permanent way. And I would imagine Iran would answer, then get the United States to stop what it's preparing to do. Are conversations like that taking place? Yes, that is exactly what Iranian officials have been saying from the beginning. But some of these countries either do not have the power to stop it, or they do not want to. Remember, these kings, princes, and ruling families own palaces in America and across Europe. They have tens or hundreds of billions in assets in the West. If their governments collapse, they will flee and leave their own populations behind. Then you would see millions moving toward Europe, crossing deserts and regional routes, and all of this as temperatures in the Arabian Peninsula rise even higher in the coming weeks. It would be an extraordinary war. You would see huge refugee flows toward Europe through Turkey and other corridors, while the global economy begins to break down. What is Trump demanding now? That Iran keep the Strait of Hormuz open, even though, by the way, it remains open to countries not aligned with the United States. But for countries cooperating with Washington, their oil is already vulnerable. And even if there were some kind of arrangement later, what good is an open strait if there are no tankers left, no oil output, no LNG production? Then the route itself becomes meaningless. What we would be looking at is a sustained removal of energy supply, but also fertilizers, petrochemicals, and financial flows. These Gulf states sell oil, then recycle that money into the United States through stocks, bonds, and weapons purchases. That whole system would be disrupted. So on many levels, ordinary Americans would suffer the consequences, but this would not stop with America. The entire world would suffer. Well, that was my next question. What about China and Russia and many countries across Asia and even African states? Some may be hit harder than anyone else. I have friends there already feeling some of the early effects. If what you're describing follows an American attack, perhaps as soon as tomorrow night, then the consequences will be long-term for everyone. Is there any diplomatic movement from any of these governments to intervene between Iran and the United States? Russia is actually benefiting in one sense, because oil prices are surging and Russia is a major exporter. Some US oil producers will also profit. It is consumers whose lives will be damaged, whose businesses will be crushed. And, as I said, the Gulf money that usually flows into Western markets may no longer flow in the same way. China, meanwhile, has some of the world's largest reserves and has stockpiled substantial energy supplies. It also has Russia as an alternative supplier. Since Europe cut many of its energy ties with Russia, much more has gone eastward. So China would be hurt, but likely less than others. But what exactly can China or Russia do if Trump is acting like a man beyond restraint? People here are asking what kind of hold exists over him, what pressure or secrets are behind this behavior for him to speak so wildly and threaten to send an entire people back to the Stone Age. What can Moscow do? What can Beijing do? At this point, the only option left for Iran is to stand firm, and if he follows through on these threats while Iran refuses to back down, then I think the world is heading toward a crisis beyond most people's imagination. And just because I know you're nearly out of time, one last question. If that does happen, if President Trump ignores everyone and launches a major strike on Iranian energy infrastructure, and Iran then responds, as you say, by systematically hitting regional assets, creating the effects you described, then one of my biggest fears from the start comes into play, that faced with disaster, Trump could escalate even further and consider using a nuclear weapon to force Iran into submission the way the United States did to Japan in 1945. What would happen then? Tehran itself could be obliterated. Is that possibility being considered on the Iranian side? It would only reveal in the clearest possible way the sinister nature of the regime in Washington. It would show the world the true face of Zionism and the logic behind it. What you are describing is its essence, something ordinary human beings would never even imagine. You and I would not contemplate harming a child. But for Netanyahu, for hardline Zionists, for Trump, and for those in Washington who place Israel first, the mass killing of civilians and the destruction of whole societies has become normal language. That is why the New York Times does not react to this rhetoric, because to them it has become normal. They look at much of the world the way Zionist ideology does, as if entire populations are disposable. As for me, you may know there is already a bounty on my head. I would rather die standing than live on my knees. And the people in the streets, when American or Israeli missiles are fired near these gatherings, I've posted those scenes myself. People can go back a few weeks and watch one of the well-known rallies where a young woman was speaking about why people remain steadfast, why they chant, "God is great." Then a missile struck nearby, and the crowd did exactly what she had described. They did not run, they did not stampede, and she kept speaking. You would think that would be headline news across the West. You would think that this PhD student from the University of Tehran would be invited onto every major network. But she was ignored because the Western press censored that image. They do not want audiences to see young Iranian women and men standing in the open, unshaken, refusing to flee, because then it becomes obvious that this woman does not need to be liberated. She is the one exposing the emptiness of those who are trapped under the influence of the Zionist lobby and the Israeli state narrative. If you can find that clip, I've shared it several times over the past few weeks. Your audience should watch it, and they should also read that book I mentioned. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us about all of this. I'm praying that by discussing the catastrophic consequences of Trump acting on these threats, not only for Tehran, but for all of us, and especially for those who would be under the bombs, maybe some good can come of putting this out there. At the very least, on a humanitarian level, that is our hope, and we intend to keep speaking about it. The Iranians are not going to surrender no matter what happens. And what this could set in motion, in my view, is a civilizational collapse across large parts of the world. We could see tens of millions, perhaps even hundreds of millions on the move, whether in Latin America or North America. Even if North America itself enters decline, migration routes will continue. The same will happen from Africa and Asia toward Europe, even as Europe itself weakens. There will be hunger, there will be famine. What Trump is threatening is almost beyond comprehension. The cruelty of his language and the implications of what he is promising are staggering. You would think they would remove him from power immediately, and you would think the legacy press would be outraged. asking how anyone could talk about sending an ancient nation, a civilization with thousands of years of history, back to the Stone Age. And for what crime? Their crime in 1979 was becoming independent of the United States. Their crime today is standing with the Palestinian people. Their crime is saying no to genocide. The crime of Iran is the same as its refusal to accept the starvation of Cuba. At the deepest level, what lies behind the hostility toward Iran is that it insists Palestinians are human beings, not expendable people. That is the real issue, and that is why they believe Iran must be crushed. Well, we appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective. And we can only pray that some path out of this is still possible, that nothing happens tomorrow night, and that the talking continues, because the more talking there is, the more lives are spared. We remain committed to speaking honestly, even on subjects like this. Thank you for being here.